Thanks so much, Jamil, and I'm thrilled to be here, so thanks to the organizers and the people who brought me. When I think about Marx, I think about revolution, so that's what I'm going to talk about today, and I'll focus specifically on the Communist Manifesto. Now, it might seem strange to talk about revolution, particularly communist revolution. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1992. For some, this means that the time of revolution has passed. They claim that capitalism and democracy won, assuming that democracy must be capitalist, and that capitalism, even as imperialism, somehow can be democratic. For them, capitalism and democracy, blended together and practically the same, allegedly proved themselves to be better, more efficient. Communism doesn't work, we're told, handed the end of the USSR as evidence, as if history always and forever is the endless repetition of the same. Instead of revolution, we're now supposed to direct our energies toward incremental changes and overlook injustice. The defenders of the status quo insist that there is no need here and now for socialists, much less critical communists who everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things, end quote from the Communist Manifesto. Now, I don't believe it. The uprisings, demonstrations, and revolts of the first decades of the 21st century indicate that capitalist democracy claimed victory too soon. These days, the failure of the system into which capitalism and democracy have converged is clear. Dramatic increases in economic inequality have convinced millions of people across the globe of the inability of capitalism to meet basic needs for food, housing, health, clean water, and education. Capitalist states actively protect the very rich, promote militarism and racism, and rely on dispossession, extraction, surveillance, and enclosure. Planetary warming, mass extinctions, sea level rise, and desertification point to the capitalist system's threat to life on Earth. Corporations, financial institutions, and international organizations and agreements block people from political arenas that claim to be democratic, pushing those of us who want to be heard onto online networks and into the streets. 100 years since the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace, political movements across the globe are taking the perspective of revolution. A new generation is returning to communism. It's an idea whose time has come again. So I'm going to highlight 3 elements of the Communist Manifesto that I think continue to be important for us today. The struggle of the proletarianized, the party, and revolution. So I begin with the struggle of the proletarianized. The Communist Manifesto gives us a vision of society split into 2 hostile classes of exploiters and exploited, oppressors and oppressed. All of history is a history of the struggle between them. In capitalist society, the primary classes are the bourgeoisie and proletariat. Bourgeoisie designates the class with resources, the owners of capital and employers of labor. Proletarians are those whose survival depends on selling their labor power. Unlike peasants, they don't have their own land. Unlike small business owners, the petty bourgeoisie, they don't own their own businesses. Proletarians are forced to earn a wage. Now, some argue today that this depiction no longer applies, if it ever did. And they usually give us 2 kinds of reasons. The first reason for the irrelevance, they say, of this distinction between bourgeoisie and proletariat, the first reason they say is that classes today are highly differentiated. Not only is there a strong middle class, not really, but that's what they say. Not only is there a strong middle class, but there are multiple economically, socially, and culturally different forms of status that resist easy categorization. The second objection to Marx's continued relevance is that identities other than those of class are more politically salient, particularly identities associated with gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, religion, and ability. And Jamil earlier was complicating these notions that are behind this critique. But let me say something more about each one of these critiques. The claim regarding class differentiation misses its target. The Communist Manifesto does not treat bourgeoisie and proletariat as fixed classes. They are not demographic categories based on income. They are positions that reflect tendencies, a tendency toward capital concentration, and a tendency toward dependency and immiseration. As modern industry develops, parts of the middle class sink down into the proletariat. Quote, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, and retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and peasants. The ruling class itself undergoes a process of dissolution. Capitalist crises, the churn and decay of industries rising and falling, these threaten the existence of sectors of the bourgeoisie. So the manifesto does not deny the presence of differentiated classes. It points to processes that impact everyone, benefiting the very few, and proletarianizing the many. The claim regarding the political relevance of identities other than class identities is more complex. It implies that communists assume that workers are all white men, thereby erasing histories and contributions of communists from all over the world, as if there had not been communist revolutions in Asia, as if communism were not important to third world anti-colonial liberation struggles, as if women were not communists. It ignores the way that some of the most visible fighters against racism have been communists and opponents of capitalism. In effect, the identitarian objection maps onto communist emphasis on proletarian revolution, a critique more applicable to a very narrow vision of trade unionism. Nevertheless, there is something to the claim for a decline in the relevance of class politics. It marks a real historical defeat, the erosion of working class political power, and the ongoing political mobilization of anti-communism. Defeated on the political plane, and the name of this defeat is neoliberalism, the left shifted to the social and cultural terrain. It fragmented into issues and identities. On some issues, and with respect to some identities, there have been political advances. But by turning away from international class struggle, the left lost the capacity to defend and advance the commitments to social welfare that had resulted from this struggle in the 20th century. Economic inequality increased, commitment to social provisioning, education, public housing, social services collapsed. By the second decade of the 21st century, the limits of identity as an operator for politics have become clear. Identity claims no longer map cleanly onto left politics. Conservative, imperialist, and capitalist positions justify themselves with recourse to identity, sometimes by emphasizing national, ethnic, and religious specificity, and sometimes by emphasizing sex, race, or sexuality. A symptom of the diminished political capacity of identity is the mutual policing of who can claim what identity and under what conditions. Like, what gives you the right or privilege to speak as a woman, as a person of color, as queer? Rather than identity functioning as the ground of a claim, its evocation is contested. Identities are sites of struggle. For example, in 2014 and 2015, riots in Ferguson and Baltimore pushed the fact of class struggle into mainstream discussions of race in the US. An African-American president had not produced material improvement in Black people's lives. As Kienga Yamada Taylor notes, after Obama came into office, Black median income fell by 10.9%. White income fell 3.6%. So class politics is back. The extreme inequality that communicative capitalism's complex networks generate and embed has made the struggle between oppressor and oppressed, proletariat and bourgeoisie, return to center stage. Now, this epic confrontation appears differently from how it did in the 19th and 20th century. The crowds and riots marking the first decades of the 21st century are the new face of global class struggle. Arab Spring, Occupy movement, Chilean student protests, Montreal fees protest, Brazilian transportation and FIFA protest, Gezi Park protest, European anti-austerity protest, Black Lives Matter, as well as multiple ongoing and intermittent strikes of teachers, communication workers, civil servants, and medical workers all over the world, are protests of the class of those proletarianized under communicative capitalism. So these are not merely the defensive struggles of a middle class facing cuts to social services, wage stagnation, unemployment, foreclosure, and indebtedness. They are fronts in class war under the conditions of global communicative capitalism, revolts of those whose communicative activities generate value that is expropriated from them. Class struggle under communicative capitalism, then, doesn't appear primarily as workplace struggles. The flexibilization and precaritization of work enabled by networked communication technology spreads communicative production throughout the social field. Struggles follow the workplace's own extension into every part of life via the expectation that workers are always reachable, always on. For contingent and mobile workers, phones are means of production. Any place is a workplace. Student, debt, housing, and education protests carry on the struggle of the proletarianized as they demand socialized rather than private solutions. Those struggles that do occur at workplaces increasingly involve communicative laborers, teachers, transport workers, and service sector workers. The changes in communication and subjectivity that accompany communicative capitalism pose real problems for the organization of the proletarianized. Inescapable demands on our attention enable images to circulate more easily than arguments, positions, and demands. We can process them faster. Intense attachments to individuality, to difference, to uniqueness, all of which are important in the struggle for jobs and opportunities, all of these hinder solidarity. But these challenges are not new. The Communist Manifesto itself notes how competition between the workers makes it hard for them to unite and organize. Marx does not simply link communism to the identity of the working class. He links it to working class movement. In the 19th century, worker uprisings were pushing forward, coming together, breaking out, and disrupting capital processes of value extraction. This active movement incites Marx to see in proletarian struggle more than demands for shorter working days, more than demands for safer working conditions and higher wages, he sees the political process of the subject of communism. And the same applies today. The movement of the proletarianized all over the world is away from and against the capitalist system that fragments and exploits us, pitting us one against another for the benefit of the 1%. It is toward that emancipatory egalitarianism that goes under the name communism. Second point, the party. Perhaps the most crucial insight of the Communist Manifesto is that class struggle is political struggle. Economic power expresses itself as political power, the power of a ruling class to make laws for its own benefit. Marx and Engels write, "The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie," end quote. So even as the Communist Manifesto presents an internationalist vision of a world under capitalism, a world characterized by colonialism, dependency, resource exploitation, and uneven concentrations of wealth, it argues for the conquest of political power by the proletariat, a struggle that occurs at the level of the nation state. To win on this front, the proletariat has to organize itself as a party and acquire political supremacy. Another way to understand this point is to recognize that the abolition of capitalism does not come about by economic destruction alone. The normal operation of the capitalist system is characterized by crises, by epidemics of overproduction. In the words of the manifesto, quote, "Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed," end quote. The bourgeoisie has created a mode of production and circulation that generates crises, engenders widespread immiseration, and calls into being the very force that will bring it down. Proletariat names capitalism's self-creation of what destroys it. The proletariat is a collective subject, a force no longer dispersed in individual and local acts of smashing, sabotage, and disruption, but concentrated through its struggles against the bourgeoisie. So Marx sees more than the power of the bourgeoisie and the misery of the proletariat. He recognizes as well the weakness of the bourgeoisie and the strength of the proletariat. Capitalist society produces those who will overthrow it, the class of proletarians, and it aids in their development. So the manifesto describes how modern industry brings previously separate and isolated workers together. Improved means of communication enable workers in different industries and localities to connect with and learn from each other. As workers start to organize themselves into a class, and consequently into a political party, they are able to exploit divisions among the bourgeoisie and secure legislative victories. The manifesto gives examples of the laws that are passed to limit the length of the working day. These victories further strengthen the working class, expanding their sense of themselves as a class. Now, contemporary capitalism has refined its capacity for wealth destruction. Over $34 trillion of market value was lost in the financial crisis of 2008. In the course of the recession that followed, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. The top 1% captured 121% of the income gains made between 2009 and 2011. Not only was the 1% better able to weather the crisis than the rest of us, but it was also able to increase its share. It's not just economic destruction that's at stake in the abolition of capitalism. It's bringing to an end the capitalist cycle of creative destruction. We could say we've got to have the destruction of destruction, and this political destruction is brought to an end by the proletariat. It's not the task of the working class organized as workers, because they're already organized as workers in the factory, which enables them to become conscious of their material conditions and the need to combine into unions. The abolition of capitalism depends on the organization of the proletariat politically, as a party, as a political association capable of cutting across workplace, sector, region, and nation. The working class as a class is implicated in the success or stability of capitalism. Capitalism configures the working class's struggles with the bourgeoisie. In contrast, the party takes as its horizon capitalism's supersession in communism. For Marx, the party is necessary because class struggle is not simply economic struggle, it's political struggle. The third part, revolution. I think we should consider the manifesto of the Communist Party as a guide for us. Its anchoring of political change in a global and historical understanding of economic production and circulation, its focus on the antagonism between proletariat and bourgeoisie at the basis of the capitalist mode of production, and its emphasis on political struggle make this nearly 200-year-old text more relevant today than it ever has been. The manifesto offers a vision of an economy out of control, a class of owners concentrating wealth in its own hands, and an ever-increasing, ever-immiserated class of wage laborers. At the same time, it locates power, possibility, and right in the hands of the oppressed. The oppressed are not simply exploited, de-skilled, and precarious. They stand up and fight back. A militant proletariat whose movement is the movement of the majority for the majority. A revolutionary class whose emancipation is the emancipation of all of society. The strength of the proletariat comes from its economic position in production and its historical role as the agent of communism. The strength of the manifesto stems from the way it links these two together to make the goal of the workers' movement a radically changed society. Now, Marx doesn't say that the workers told him this. He doesn't present evidence from existing socialists who are advocating much more than bourgeois revolution. Rather, he presents communist revolution as what the ruling class fears. The manifesto of the Communist Party begins and ends by describing communism as a threat. The famous opening, "A specter is haunting Europe," the specter of communism. And then the saucy close, "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution." The ruling class is not as strong as they want us to think. They're afraid of us, the workers, the many, the oppressed. A ruling class that relies on force, on walls and police and incarceration, that relies on all this for security, is fundamentally and existentially insecure. The power of the idea of communism derives from the effect it has on the proletariat's class enemies, an effect that precedes the existence of the proletariat organized as a party of communists. Marx seizes that fear. He doesn't say, "Oh, let's not call ourselves communists because that's too controversial." He doubles down, championing the term and declaring the need for the forcible overthrow of all existing conditions. This boldness is yet another reason the manifesto is an indispensable guide for us today. Today, the ruling class's fear of communism appears in sometimes surprising places. For example, Barack Obama gave a speech where he positioned fascist, communist, jihadists, and homegrown demagogues as threats to American values. Communist, nearly 30 years after the defeat of the Soviet Union, and capitalist democracy's declaration of victory are as dangerous as terrorists. Now, why did Obama feel the need to call communists such a threat? Because communist, as Marx well knew, is the name that we have for a society without exploitation, a society where people collectively determine how to produce for their common needs, as well as the name for someone who fights to realize such a society. At a time of ever-increasing economic inequality and state violence, as well as of rising popular militancy and increased support for socialism, Obama was trying to exorcise a specter that continues to haunt the ruling class. But this continued haunting is our signal to champion the name communist again. In fact, anti-communism is on the increase. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Orban in Hungary, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, the Alliance for Deutschland in Germany, Modi in India. All of these campaign as anti-communists. Across the globe, the movements of the proletarianized keep the perspective of revolution alive. People are rioting, demonstrating, and organizing against capitalist dispossession of their labor, lives, and futures. Because capitalism's system of dispossession operates through the wage, debt, privatization, enclosure, theft, colonization, financialization, and racialized state violence, the movements of the proletarianized mobilize a broad international array of people and concerns. Describing the unfitness of the bourgeoisie to be the ruling class, Marx emphasizes the sinking conditions of the working class. The producer can no longer produce but must be fed. In the words of the manifesto, society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. The incompatibility of capitalism with society is most undeniable when we look at anthropogenic climate change. What the manifesto calls modern industry has set off atmospheric warming that's leading to temperatures not seen on the planet for millions of years. There are multiple effects: melting glaciers, thawing permafrost, sea level rise, desertification. The repercussions for human society include the loss of hundreds of thousands of miles of coastline, the submersion of coastal cities and communities, the loss of arable and pasturable land, the loss of fresh water, the loss of ways of life, increasing numbers of refugees, increasing conflict and resource wars. But global capital has proven unfit for addressing climate change. Investment in extractive industries and fossil fuels continue. Coal mining, oil drilling, and fracking continue. Large-scale commodity production and shipping continue. That one city, state, or country might bring carbon emissions under control is irrelevant from the standpoint of overall warming. It could just as easily ship its carbon-emitting industries elsewhere. Climate change forces us to acknowledge that not all communities, economies, and ways of life are compatible. A capitalist economy premised on production for the sake of private capital accumulation stands in fundamental conflict with the planning and transformation necessary for dismantling the industries and practices that contribute to planetary warming. Forcing that change is the political challenge of our time, which is why a popular slogan is system change, not climate change. Now, some read Marx as advocating a productivism where the point of proletarian revolution is eliminating the fetters on production caused by bourgeois relations of production. And the manifesto points in this direction when it says that the proletariat will use its political supremacy to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. But a better reading of Marx recognizes that while continued industrial development may have made sense in the 19th century, the meaning of industrial development has changed. In the 21st century, we must face the global fact of uneven development and the impact of this unevenness on production, trade, modes of life, and capacity to adapt to and mitigate the effects of a changing climate. The relations of production and circulation in imperialist society are fetters. They prevent the development of modes of production and circulation liberated from fossil fuels. They foreclose large-scale planning. The contemporary capitalist economy privileges expensive and fanciful high-tech solutions that let the very rich continue to increase their wealth while the rest are relegated to sacrifice zones. Today, the movement of the proletarianized is the movement of all whom capitalism deprives of a future, all whose work and lives are expropriated from them by 1% that presumes that the rest of us are either for them or non-existent. Those proletarianized by climate change are thus those whose land is becoming uninhabitable and whose lives are becoming unlivable. All over the world, on Pacific islands that will soon be submerged, in African and Middle Eastern countries scorched by rising temperatures, in territories inhabited by native, indigenous, and First Nation people witnessing the unfolding calamity of species loss, and in global cities where millions encounter undrinkable water and unbreathable air, the proletarianized appear with new faces, new demands, and new certainty that the only way forward is together, collectively. The struggle around climate change is the struggle for communism. To conclude, the Communist Manifesto continues to be a guide for us, practically, because the interests of the capitalist class remain opposed to those of the rest of us, the proletarianized. Society is fundamentally divided. They are our enemy. Their flourishing depends on our misery. The only way this will change in a way that will benefit us all is if we force it. The fact of the fundamental division between the capitalist class and the rest of us makes revolutionary force necessary, and it makes it right.